afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak at the dialogues. I'm very honoured. It's the first time I've been to a symposium or dialogue of this sort, and it's very difficult to follow an inspiring example that you've just heard about culture and art. I'm here very much to talk about the physical, and I'm thankful that the rejig of the programme meant that Peter Murray went first and could elicit all of the reactions to the tall buildings in London, which I'm going to be concentrating on. So in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to provide a very short and a very simplified history of the evolution of London before considering very briefly some of the factors that are driving the recent emergence of those tall buildings. And I will illustrate two of the key issues which are causing us most concern, and then finally add some personal thoughts. And this is the disclaimer, otherwise I do want to keep my job, I'm a bureaucrat. These are my personal views on why the current situation is of concern. In such a limited time, I can only skim the surface of what is a complex topic, but I hope nevertheless it will prove to be of interest. You've heard already that London's described as a city of villages, which is the result of its organic expansion over centuries. Its origins, actually, are as a trading settlement mainly along the north bank of a multi-channel River Thames and set within rising ground to north and south. And the basic structure of London that you can still see today emerged in the early medieval period following the invasion of William, Duke of Normandy, and the establishment of the Tower of London to the east. Tower of London, City of London. This fortress, palace and seat of government commanded entry to the Thames, protected the only bridge linking north and south, which was located just to the west of the tower, and was set below the rising ground on which subsequently stood the old St. Paul's Cathedral in the city itself. Over the course of the next centuries, the emergence of the city of Westminster, centred on the Abbey, which was the resting place of Edward the Confessor, provided the spiritual and later political counterbalance to the city or corporation of London to the east. And development emerged along the main routes linking the two centres. Settlement to the south of the river was very sparse, and this was due mainly to the marshy nature of the land, and was concentrated south of London Bridge around Southwark. This duality of twin centres at the heart of London remains as strong today as it's ever been, with the cities of Westminster and the Corporation of London both fiercely independent and protective of their identities as cities as distinct from London as the capital of the United Kingdom. The expansion of London from the 16th to the early 19th centuries was, and those are the two cities, White Tower on the right and the Palace of Westminster on the left. The expansion of London from the 16th to the early 19th centuries was largely to the north and northwest, with speculative development by landowners creating the great estates of terraces and squares that have now become another distinctive characteristic of the capital. To the east, the devastation of the Great Fire in the 17th century enabled the rebuilding of the old city of London and the construction of the new St. Paul's. South of the river, development extended from Lambeth, stimulated by the construction of a second bridge across the Thames at Westminster. And for the 17th, 18th, and indeed into the early 19th century, the scale of development, densely urban, was largely of brick with civic buildings in stone. It was the introduction of further transport infrastructure and largely railways which supported the rapid expansion of London in the 19th century. The creation of one of the greatest dock complexes in the world downstream from the Tower of London facilitated international trade and the importation of goods from across the British Empire. This period also saw the remodelling of Westminster, the creation of the new Palace of Westminster, and the concentration of imperial government in Whitehall, so that by the turn of the 20th century, London was one of the greatest cities the world had ever seen. However, it was also in parts one of the most densely populated with great inequality, including squalid slums. Metropolitan improvements were started, including the Great Embankment of the Thames, to address the sanitation crisis, and the clearance of the slums to be replaced by garden cities and planned suburbs. The emergence of the first underground line in London in the 1860s was followed in the interwar period by the rapid expansion of the tube network. And it's interesting to note that even up to, in this period, the tube network reflected the density of development to the north of the Thames and the paucity of relative development to the south. The infrastructure and the division of London is not only east and west, but very strongly north and south. All of this infrastructure enabled commuting to the congested capital for work, but allowed for living outside the centre, which is a pattern that remains strong today. The agent for one of the biggest transformations in the character, and that's Metroland, just to give you an idea of the 20th century type of planned suburb. The agent for one of the biggest transformations in the character and appearance of London was the destruction arising from the Blitz in the Second World War. Focused on the East End with its concentration of docks and industry, and on the city around St Paul's, itself a symbolic target, it changed the character of this part of the capital. In contrast, the city of Westminster emerged relatively unscathed. Post-war rebuilding was an urgent necessity and stimulated strategic thinking about the future of the whole of the centre of the capital, incorporating both cities, by Patrick Abercrombie, who drew up plans for the transformation of London based on the car and separate zoning of activities. That plan, thankfully, was only partly implemented in an ad hoc manner due to a combination of factors, and for much of the latter half of the 20th century, London was in gradual decline. Some inner areas to the north became gentrified over time, but other areas to the south and the east declined because of closure of the docks, closure of other major industry, and the resulting falling of the London population. Whilst the character and appearance of Westminster remained little changed during the post-war period, the east of the capital, both north and south of the river, underwent significant rebuilding. This included large amounts of social housing and some of London's first tall buildings, distributed apparently randomly and seen as a quick and easy response to the need to replace significant swathes of housing, including that lost or damaged in the war. But it was a decision by the Thatcher government to allow the financial Big Bang in the 1980s, coupled with the creation of the Docklands Development Corporation, a light touch planning regime, to regenerate the failed industrial areas around what is now Canary Wharf, that provided the impetus for the Corporation of London to embark on further radical plans to build tall in what has become known as the Eastern Cluster, and Peter referred to that earlier. It's a signal of their determination to retain their dominance as a world financial centre. This cluster as a concept was rudimentary, and its location and extent was primarily determined through the identification of constraints. These included the London Strategic Views, which are focused on St Paul's, and the St Paul's Heights policy. However, the proposed number of buildings in the cluster, all commercial, was modest by today's standards. So at the turn of the century, turn of the millennium, the character and appearance of the central core of London can be simply summarised as twin cities, each the result of layers of history linked by the open corridor of the Thames, but of very different characters. To the west, Westminster, a city containing some 12,000 historic or listed buildings. Over 70% of Westminster designated as a conservation area because of its historic character and appearance, with the Palace of Westminster, Westminster Abbey and St Margaret's World Heritage Site at its core, adjacent to the Thames. It has a rich mix of residential uses of great variety. It has high-end retail, it has government and cultural institutions. It has theatre land, and it has commercial uses that draw directly on the quality of the historic environment as part of their brand. Think of Bond Street, Mayfair and St James. To the east, we have the City of London, with an equally rich history, but one characterised by cycles of major change. It retains its medieval structure of routes and lanes, but is predominantly commercial, with, at present, a very small residential community. It's a city reinvented to provide a very different kind of commercial activity requiring large floor plates. Its brand is global, and it's one that still draws on the cultural heritage of the city as a financial centre and its reputation, although that's become rather more tattered, more than its physical heritage. Nevertheless, it contains important national, indeed international, heritage symbols, including St Paul's Cathedral, Tower Bridge, and the Tower of London World Heritage Site, again adjacent to the Thames. So if we turn to the drivers for change and the current construction boom, the globalisation of commerce and increasing importance of the financial and service sectors to the UK economy, replacing the former manufacturing base, have presented London as a city with several advantages. A geographical proximity to Europe, combined with a tradition of trade and commerce, particularly as a financial centre, have created a city that regards itself as having more in common with its global counterparts, for example New York, Paris or Singapore, than with other cities within the United Kingdom. The rich diversity of London's physical environment and the breadth of its cultural facilities have made it an attractive city internationally in which to work and also to visit. The relative political stability of the United Kingdom, a favourable position in terms of time zones, which allows London to link Far Eastern and American financial markets, combined with that light touch approach to regulation, have all come together to proclaim London as a city that welcomes investment. However, following the financial crash of 2008, recent global economic and political problems, what should be positive factors are combining with domestic political ideology that pushes for economic growth at almost any cost to produce a construction boom that threatens to undermine two of London's most important competitive advantages. Those are the diversity and quality of its physical environment and the quality of life it offers to potential residents and visitors. It's well recognised throughout history there are cycles of construction and decline, primarily influenced by political and economic factors. In the 1990s, London began to move from a long period of decline, its population stabilising and then beginning to grow, and you've heard the figures from Peter this morning. As this growth picked up pace, a change in governance for London, with the creation of the Greater London Authority led by an elected mayor, has meant that the profile of the capital has also increased, particularly with the current mayoral incumbent. The creation of a London plan, the planning framework, intending to address the emerging issues of housing and the provision of employment for growing population, has not managed to rectify the impact of previous decisions, the privatisation of much of London's public housing stock, or the political decision to fund new social or so-called affordable housing and much-needed infrastructure, largely through private development and investment. The approach taken by London government consistently from the time of the first Planning Act in 1947 is to divide the capital broadly into a central activity zone located along the Thames and including the twin cities of Westminster and the City of London itself, and the outer boroughs, which have been divided in different ways over time, but they're always secondary. As the housing issue has become ever more acute, this approach has now been adapted, added to, by the strategic identification for intensification and what are described as opportunity areas, where it's proposed that major change involving high density will make a substantial contribution to resolving what has in fact become a crisis. The opportunity areas have been identified primarily with regard to transport and are often on former industrial or brownfield sites with significant mitigation or additional infrastructure requirements that increase the cost of their development. Development values needed to address some of these basic issues attract large influxes of funding from sovereign wealth funds and international investors. However, they see London in terms of an investment or a temporary haven, which has led to the phenomenon of what Peter Rees, the ex-Chief Planning Officer of the Corporation of London, has described as safety deposit boxes in the sky. In other words, the creation of a building type that primarily serves the needs of external investors, but is wrongly being justified as the only way to address London's housing needs and supply funds to provide much-needed infrastructure, primarily transport, like Crossrail and Crossrail 2. The impact of this type of development on the existing character and appearance of the capital is by its very nature substantial, and where left unmanaged, politically damaging. This is particularly the case for the cities of Westminster and London, including their World Heritage sites. And I would like to highlight the risk by illustrating the two issues. The first is the recent explosion in the number of tall building proposals in London, and the second is the lack of effective implementation of existing policy. Building tall is a relative concept, depends on context. The Tower of London, specifically the White Tower, was a tall building for its time. Its height was the result of function and also it's symbolic. The old St Paul's Cathedral was the tallest building in London for centuries, and its replacement, Wren's St Paul's, although lower, remained the dominant building on London's skyline until the mid-20th century. Much of London's remained consistent in terms of height until the 19th century because of technological factors. However, when construction technology enabled building tall, London didn't follow New York. It wasn't through ignorance, but it was because of cultural differences. The first commercial skyscraper in London was not built until the late 1920s. It didn't appear as a building type again until the 1950s and 60s, largely in isolated examples, including the Shell Centre, Centre Point. Until the 1980s, the experience of building tall in London was largely confined to cheap, system-built residential towers, usually between 10 and 20 stories high and poorly maintained. The first tall residential buildings proposed after the millennium and ones that began to raise concern were on the south bank of the Thames, in Lambeth at Doon Street and St George's Wharf at Vauxhall. These are areas adjacent to the heart of the city. They'd fallen into decline, and their regeneration was seen by the local councils as offering significant financial benefits. For the developer of St George, the attraction of having views over the Thames towards the historic core of Westminster and the World Heritage Site added incredible value. And it's become the first of what is a series of proposed tall residential buildings along the south side of the Thames, which derives high values from their views north and east over those two twin cities of Westminster and the City of London. Both Doon Street and St George's Wharf created controversy because of their visual impact on the setting of historic buildings to the north, for example Somerset House and indeed the Palace of Westminster. And because of that controversy, both went through an examination in public at a public inquiry, where independent planning inspectors and design experts said they should not be built. In both instances, that decision was overruled by a government minister. The signal sent by these decisions was that the historic environment, London's legacy, was of less importance than the perceived economic benefit arising from the provision of new buildings. However, it's the next proposal for Europe's tallest building, I'll come back to that one, for Europe's tallest building, the Shard, that proved to be the tipping point, with architectural quality being thrown into the mix to use to justify harm. The issue of architectural quality and the extent to which it can mitigate harm was considered with this building, the Gherkin, when it was first proposed. In this instance, the perceived harm to the setting of the Tower of London World Heritage Site was felt to be mitigated by the quality of the design of this building and the already compromised nature of the setting and the limited views of the new development from within the tower. Some would say that's a conclusion that's been justified by the enthusiastic reception the building has received and its appearance on skyline silhouettes of London, valued in its own right. However, the Shard intrudes significantly into the setting of both the Tower of London and, most dramatically, one of the key views of St Paul's, that gained from the high ground of the north. That view has been irrevocably damaged by the clumsy juxtaposition of a new building immediately behind the defining architectural element of the cathedral, its dome. The issue of architectural quality as a justification for tall buildings was raised shortly again after the Shard was given consent with the first proposals for Elizabeth House. The site, adjacent to the Grade 2 listed Waterloo Station and south of the Palace of Westminster World Heritage Site, And here you are looking from Westminster Square south across the river with the iconic, and I hate that word, but it is true in this case, the iconic Queen Elizabeth II Tower containing Big Ben. That is the gap, the view that is regarded as so important. There was a long planning battle against 3 tall buildings, which were dubbed the Ugly Sisters. It resulted in a refusal of this plan and the identification of the setting of the Palace of Westminster and the sky gap between the Elizabeth Tower, between the Queen Elizabeth Tower as being important. But equally important was the fact that the refusal was actually on the grounds that the architectural expression of the towers was too assertive and dominant. A further issue at the inquiry was the amount of development proposed, which was driving the height and mass. But a subsequent and now current scheme by another developer maintains the same quantum of development, with a similar negative impact on both the World Heritage Site, but also on the adjacent historic station buildings. And this is by David Chipperfield. And that is the Grade 2 Victory Memorial Arch to Waterloo Station. This time, despite huge opposition and concern, including from UNESCO, and interestingly, from within parts of the UK government, the department responsible for planning declined to have this proposal considered at a public inquiry. UNESCO has stated that they regard this proposal as a litmus test of the commitment of the UK government to protecting its outstanding historic environment. UNESCO are clear: if this application is given permission, the Westminster World Heritage Site will be placed at risk. If it's built, the World Heritage status could be removed. The Vauxhall Nine Elms Opportunity Area, stretching along the south bank of the river, is the clearest example of the issues at the heart of an increasingly widespread public concern about the management of tall buildings in London. A study into the sudden increase in the proposed number of tall buildings, which Peter alluded to, carried out by the NLA, had revealed a startling increase in the proposed number of schemes. And those are tall buildings defined as being over 20 stories high. Of particular concern to English heritage is that the initial urban design studies that produced the planning framework for the regeneration of this opportunity area identified that the existing St George's Wharf that you've already seen should form the apex of a new cluster of buildings at about 150 metres, and that was reached after careful consideration of potential impact and consensus through consultation. However, within a short period of the production of that framework, proposals for buildings 180 metres high were produced, promoting a different form of cluster, and they were being promoted by developers on behalf of international investors, with the acquiescence of the Greater London Authority. As I stand and speak to you now, proposals are being submitted for buildings 200 metres tall on this site, and we have a leapfrogging competition which has broken out between developers, and all sense of a coherent plan-led approach underpinned by sound urban design analysis has collapsed. In the east, in the City of London, the long-established plan-led approach of the city cluster has similarly recently been seriously undermined by the construction of this building, the walkie-talkie. It is located outside the policy area for tall buildings in the city and was promoted on the grounds of its architectural quality, subsequently dumbed down, and the provision of the Sky Garden, which is in fact an open space open mainly by appointment and largely occupied by expensive restaurants and bars. The damaging impact of this building in views along the river, in the setting of the Tower of London, and most shockingly, in relation to Tower Bridge, has caused public outcry. Whilst it might be hoped that this building would serve as a reminder of the need to consider tall buildings with care, especially where they have the potential to radically change the setting of London's finest historic buildings, at present this does not seem to be happening. Within the last year, proposals have come forward for further residential buildings in London Dock by Berkeley Homes, who are the developers of St George's Wharf. And this is their proposal. A private residential tower. If you wish to buy one of the one-bedroom apartments, it will cost you £800,000. If you want anything bigger, it will be 1.x million. These are homes for Londoners. This will erode the finest remaining view of the silhouette formed by Tower Bridge. There are also current proposals for the Bishopsgate goods yard, which Peter illustrated, again being driven by international investors that involve 2 residential towers, and those towers will appear above the silhouette of the White Tower in the Tower of London, between its turrets, undermining the visual dominance in views from the Tower Bridge. So in conclusion, London's always been a city that relied on international trade. The flow of goods and people into the city has created the wealth and the resources to leave this physical legacy that's second to none. The dynamic character of London, with layers of history side by side, has made it in some ways uniquely democratic, attractive, exciting to visit, with communities from all across the world able to find a place within its streets. In the last 5 years, the amount of foreign investment into London has increased substantially. It's become regarded as a good bet to ensure a healthy return on investment. But that investment is not being directed to the benefit of ordinary Londoners and is not responding to the unique physical environment in a sympathetic or appropriate way. The emergence of large developments of high-rise residential blocks aimed at international investors have driven up land values, are squeezing out existing communities. The increasing cost of property to buy or rent is placing it out of reach of all but a tiny minority, eroding the economic base of local businesses and cultural institutions that rely on existing communities which are being displaced. The centuries-old morphology of central London, its twin cities linked functionally, symbolically and physically by the Thames, is being lost in the creation of dense clusters of downtown developments, primarily along the Thames, from Vauxhall in the west to Deptford in the east. Boris Johnson proclaims London as the greatest city on earth. He set out his vision for its future. It's a vision that is singularly lacking in a coherent spatial approach, or one that demonstrates he has actually understood the DNA of his city. The task is clear. If London's heritage is not to be lost, we have to be able to articulate its value beyond the simply economic or mechanistic, and we have to overcome a complacency that London and its heritage will always be with us. Thank you.